Hey, this is Trissa from Sewing and Things, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to sew up the Constance using just your sewing machine. Now, most sewing machines should have stretch stitches. Some of them will have the lightning bolt stitch, some of them will just have basic stitches like the zigzag. However, every sewing machine should have a few stretch stitches. So I'll show a close-up of this, but I have a bunch of stitches on this machine, and your machine should tell you which ones are the stretch stitches in your manual. I have a lightning bolt, and I have zigzag, and I have the triple stitch. The triple stitch sometimes is a little bit too much. My preference for me sewing is usually the lightning bolt stitch or the overlock stitch. And so, but I'll show you those a little bit later. So when you are sewing with a sewing machine, you want to get some test fabric to test some stitches before you start sewing your fabric, just because your fabric can easily get stretched out while you're sewing on your sewing machine. And so when you do your test stitches, you want to make sure you are doing 2 layers of fabric, since when you are sewing 2 pieces together, you're going to be sewing 2 layers thick. And so you always want to start off with some test stitches, and that way you can adjust your tension. Well, you can adjust your stitch length. You can't really adjust your tension on a sewing machine, but you can adjust your stitch length to make it work a little bit better. I know some people prefer using a walking foot. However, I have never used one before, so I can't be of any assistance with that. But so I have some baby waffle that I'm going to do some test stitches on, and I also have some rayon spandex, which I have a Constance for my daughter that I'm going to sew up on my sewing machine. And so you have to test both the horizontal stretch as well as a vertical stretch. If your fabric doesn't have a lot of vertical stretch, that's fine. And it'll be less likely to stretch out along the side seams. You will really need to be careful when sewing the neckband on, and then when you're hemming, and a little bit when you're sewing the sleeves. And so you just want to be really careful that you're not stretching your fabric while you're sewing it, and you want to make sure your machine is feeding it through on its own. And so I will show you a few stitches. I'm going to start off with the lightning bolt stitch. So you can see here, it's like a little bit of a zigzag. Focus on there. It's a little bit of a zigzag, and so it stretches with it. And you can see it's not going to really stretch it out, which is good. You don't want it to stretch it. And then another stitch is a triple stitch, which is not my preference. And if you ever have to rip out stitches, ripping out triple stitches is the worst thing ever. You can see here it's like a straight line, but it's thicker and it stretches. See the difference? I think the lightning bolt stretches a little bit better. It's a lot tighter the stretch. But yeah, I like the lightning bolt stitch. Another one you can use is a overlock stitch, which Let's see if I can find it. Cold at that. Okay, I found it. So let's see what this stitch looks like. So this is like an overcast stitch. So you can do that by your seam allowance and then trim along the side, but it's like kind of like an overlock stitch. That's fine too, and it stretches nicely. And then, but yeah, so you can kind of play with it. Look in your manual. If you don't have an actual manual, you can look online, and all manuals should be available online. And then you can kind of see what stretch stitches are available and then use those. But I prefer to use the lightning bolt stitch. It's usually my preference. My last machine didn't have a lightning bolt stitch, so I couldn't use that. But my new one does. So, but I still like to sew my cuffs together using my triple stitch. Since my lightning bolt stitch, I can see some stitches through it a little bit when you pull it apart, which I don't totally love. But yeah, make sure you use matching thread. But now let's try it on this baby waffle. Can't really, it's kind of hard to see. But see, and I just let my machine feed it through, and it stretches. This one doesn't stretch very much that way. I should probably do it this way instead. There's that one. And you can see that one's a little bit tighter because it's the triple stitch. Then we'll go to the lightning bolt stitch. Again, it's kind of hard to see that. Blends in, but stretches with it, so that's good. And then you can sort of see my stitches a little bit in there. That's the zigzag or the lightning bolt, and then in here is the triple stitch. But yeah, so your machine should have some it should have some stretch stitches. You want to make sure you're not pulling on your fabric while it's feeding through. You can also adjust your pressure foot tension. You don't want it to press too hard on it because then it'll hold your fabric. It'll like hold your fabric while it's sewing, and then it'll stretch it, and you don't want that. And sometimes another way, if it is getting wavy, you can increase your stitch length a little bit so it's further apart, and that can help also if you have any waviness. But really for the main construction, it should be fine. You really need to worry about not stretching the neckband too much, and you don't want to stretch the hems also when you're sewing. And so yeah, so let me grab my Constance and then let's get sewing. So as always, we start off by taking our front and back pieces, laying them right sides together, and we're going to start by sewing the shoulder seams together. And you want to make sure that on your sewing machine, you should have little gauge, little markings of where your seam allowances are. I have a 10 millimeters for 3/8 of an inch. And so if those markings are hard to see, you can get some washi tape, masking tape, something to put on that, because that's what's going to make your seam straight, is to making sure you are running the raw edge along that mark on your sewing machine. Because if you go off of it, then your seam allowance is going to be off. So you want to make sure that you are staying and keeping your fabric straight along that line. And so, yeah, tape helps if you need to use that. Yeah. Also, sometimes your machine might eat your fabric, and that could be because you need to use a different needle. But also to prevent that is so sometimes you can hold on to your thread while you're sewing in the beginning and kind of help it along with the first few stitches. You can also start a little bit past the raw edge. Just make sure you're not starting further than what the seam allowance is. And so you have both shoulder seams sewn using the lightning bolt stitch, and knit fabric won't fray, but you can finish the edge with a zigzag stitch if you want, but it's not necessary. It does make it look a little bit cleaner, but it doesn't matter. No one's going to look on the inside of the shirt anyway. But so once your shoulder seams are sewn, you want your little teeny tiny cuffs, at least these ones are really tiny, not cuffs, sleeves. So I'm sewing the 6-month version, and so if you are sewing the smaller ones, you can hem this first, hem it in the flat. Sometimes that's easier than trying to maneuver around that, but I'm going to do it last. But it can make it a little bit easier. But go ahead and we want to mark it in the center, since these sleeves are cut on the fold. And then also, since it's cut on the fold, your shoulder seam will be the middle point. And so you want to start off by pinning those on. Can't really see this, I'm sorry. But I start by pinning the center one first, the shoulder seam, and then I pin the sleeves to both ends. So it'll be pinned in the 3 spots. And then I turn it around, and then I'll slightly stretch the bodice so it fits the sleeve cap, and then add some pins in there. So now with your sleeve all pinned, you're ready to start sewing that one. I like to sew with the sleeve on the bottom. That's just my preference. I feel like it's a little bit easier. And so the same thing as before, you can start a little bit past the sleeve, just don't go more than 3/8 of an inch. And then also hold on to those threads to help make sure your fabric is not getting sucked through. And this part can be a little tricky just because it's a curve. And so I always occasionally stop, readjust the fabric. Yeah, let me see if I can get a better angle for you. So you always want to adjust to make sure that raw edge is lining up with that mark on your machine. That way your seam allowance is staying consistent. You ever have to stop sewing, make sure you stop with your needle going into your fabric. That way your fabric doesn't slip out. see that. Then you do the same thing on the other side. You always want to make sure that your fabric is flat coming under here. You don't want it to get twisted, since your sleeve can easily get twisted. So you want to make sure you're always stopping and making sure that it's nice and smooth. And even though you ease your sleeve cap to the arm sky, you want to make sure that you are not stretching this while it's going through. You want to let it feed on its own, and then just make sure you're keeping both edges lined up. And the more pins you need, the better. That's totally fine. Whatever you need to do to keep it together, and just make sure you're not stretching it. And you want to just let the machine feed it on its own. There's the other one. So now what we're going to do is sew up the side seam. I like to match up the top of the sleeve first. I'm going to again use as many pins as you need to. I like to do the top and the bottom and then add more pins going through, or sometimes I go rogue and I don't pin at all. But I'll add a few more. And then you'll pin the other side same way, starting at where the sleeve attaches, putting a pin or a clip there. And I like to do the bottom. And since my sleeves are really short, I am not I usually don't worry about pinning those since this is size 6 months. The sleeve is like teeny tiny, so I don't worry about pinning that. So then we'll sew that exactly the same way as we have before. And do the other side. Side's done. And you can backstitch on some of these if you want, if you're not going to be finishing your edge, or you can leave your tails long and tie them off. Then you can go ahead and turn it around. And here is a little shirt so far. And so then we want to attach our neckband. So again, I like to sew my neckband in around using the triple stitch. I just like it a little bit better. So that's what I'm going to do. And even though I sew everything on my sewing machine, I still do this. See, now with that open, it'll be nice and flat when we sew that, rather than having all the seams, all the fabric on one side. I like this, it's a little less bulky. And so we want to start by pinning our neckband. So you want to get your neckband and mark the quarter points. So you take your center back and then find your center front quarter point, and then you'll put those two together to find your other two, and then mark them with a pin. And then you do the same thing on your bodice, and know that the shoulder seams are not a quarter point, so don't use them as one or you will get a wonky neckband or neck opening. So put your two seams together to find your center front. And then again, put them together to find your center back and put a pin in it. And then you'll match up both your center front and center back together to find your quarter point. You can see it's not, there's my seam, it's not anywhere near the seam. And do the same thing on the other side. Once you have all your corner points marked, we're going to match them up. So make sure you are doing the center back, not the center front. You'll take your neckband. And also, real quick, if your neckband stretches a lot, well, if it curls while you're stretching, like if you stretch it a really lot and see how it starts to curl, to help with that when you're sewing it on, you can do a wide zigzag stitch all the way around just to hold the edges together to keep it from curling. And then that way, when you're stretching it to fit, your edges aren't coming off. It'll help it to have a even seam allowance all the way around. So that's a little quick tip. But now let's pin our things together, matching up the back with the back. Once all your quarter points have been matched up, you want to slightly stretch your neckband to match the raw edge of your shirt, and then go ahead and add a few more pins all the way around. So once that is all pinned, we are ready to start sewing. I like to sew with it inside out. Feel like it's a little bit easier. And we'll basically just be doing the same thing as we've been starting before. I like to start before that seam. I like to start before it, and then when I come around, I'll pass it and overlap it slightly. And then don't forget to back tack at the end. See, that has all been sewn on. Flip it around. And then you can also go around and top stitch this. So I like to top stitch using my cover stitch, but you can also get a twin needle and top stitch with that. You can also do a zigzag stitch, and that basically just holds this fabric down, and it helps keep the neckline to lie flat. So you can do a zigzag stitch. You sometimes can use a straight stitch. Sometimes it might help to use woolly nylon in the bobbin or stretch thread to give it a little bit extra stretch. And also you want your stitch length to be a little bit wider or a little bit longer rather than shorter, because if it's shorter, you're more likely for it to stretch out and be all wavy, and you don't want that.
To stay up to date on the latest videos, be sure to subscribe to my channel, or you can check out my blog at sewingandthings.com.